Hello, my name's Debbie Evans from UK Column, and welcome to another interview. Well, this interview is a bit different because brave new world, maybe brave New Zealand, because today I'm crossing the globe and I'm whizzing across to New Zealand to meet an educational consultant. Dr. Ursula Edgington is with me today. And Ursula is an academic, she's a writer, she's a researcher, and she's a teacher. But honestly, she is the most amazing writer. I have to say, do please check out her Substack. And all of the details will be in the article beneath this interview, because Ursula has covered pretty much every topic you can imagine. And her style of writing, I have sat and laughed a lot. Her humour is amazing. So we're going to be speaking to Ursula today about life in New Zealand and how it's different, or perhaps it's the same as New Zealand, and I just as the UK. And I just want to sort of bring people back down to earth a minute, because Zealand and the United Kingdom are a very similar size, and yet the population of New Zealand is just over 5 million, and the population of the United Kingdom is 67, 68 million. So you can see the size of the countries are very similar, but the population is very different. But I'm just delighted to welcome a Brit that's moved to New Zealand and can tell us all about it. Ursula, welcome to UK Column, and thank you for getting up so early, because I have to tell our viewers, it's 7 o'clock in the evening in the UK, and it's silly o'clock in the morning in New Zealand, and you've got up specially to speak to us. So thank you so much and welcome.
Hi, Debbie. Thank you for inviting me. It's brilliant to be here.
Ursula, as I said at the beginning in the introduction, I don't know where to start because there are just so many topics. So I think the easiest thing for me to do is, as you're a Brit now living in New Zealand, and you've been there a good few years now, tell us the differences that you see, or maybe the similarities, what I would see if I was coming to New Zealand. How is it different?
Well, first, I've got to say the weather. I don't think I realised before I was here how much difference the climate does make to your health and well-being. I think in the UK, people are very much focused on getting to the holidays for their 2 weeks in the sun in wherever, Spain or France, etc. And it's that treadmill, isn't it, of just working and getting to your holiday. And so, yeah, definitely the climate here, where I am in particular in the Waikato, is subtropical. So, it's rare that we have a frost. There's very warm weather pretty much all year. We don't really have a winter as such. So it does make a difference to the way that New Zealanders live, and to people's, certainly to my personal sort of optimism, I suppose. I'm an optimistic person by nature anyway, so that definitely helps. And of course, more recently, with the discussions around the importance of vitamin D to our bodies, it kind of makes sense, really, that getting out into the sunshine is helpful for our health and well-being. So we've been here for 10 years. So over those 10 years, things have changed, obviously quite a lot for us personally, and obviously in the last 4 years, especially with the COVID craziness. So it's difficult to compare it directly, like you say, about my life in the UK. Here we live a relatively quiet rural life. We're on just over an acre of land, so we're pretty self-sufficient. We've got sheep in the paddock, and my beehives, and chickens and quails and whatnot. So it's it's a bit of the good life in some respects, but it's a different way of thinking about the good life, because it's relatively rural compared to the majority of New Zealanders who live in that, what we call the Golden Triangle. So Auckland, around the Auckland area, a large proportion, I forget what it is, it's about 60%, I think, of the population live in and around Auckland. of the 5 million. So that means really that the rest, as you say, the 5 million in the rest of New Zealand, it is a very sparse population, very isolated in some areas. And so, it's a very different way of life. I think the other thing to mention is the traffic congestion. There is none really. There is some around the main towns, and certainly Auckland is problematic because of its geography, getting into and out of. But the speed limits are relatively low. 100 kilometres an hour is a typical rural road, and you can very easily measure how long it's going to take you to get there, because you won't be stuck at traffic lights or roundabouts or with traffic congestion in any way. So that also makes a big difference. The other thing to mention is the way of life. For New Zealanders, really, work isn't that important. Their priority is family life, which has its pros and cons. There's lots of public holidays. Professional identity isn't really that important. It's lower priority. It's more important to be at home, to go fishing, or to go to the beach or whatever. So there's sort of an anti-intellectualism here, especially in education, that I've come up against. That's quite difficult to overcome, and isn't necessarily a positive learning environment for my adult students to be in. So that's that sort of gives you an overview of what life is like.
It has given me an overview, but as viewers and listeners will know by now, I always talk to my guests before we interview them. And I was pretty shocked, actually, Ursula, because while you say there's no traffic congestion, and that's fantastic, and the roads are empty, sort of, you told me also that it's lawless on New Zealand roads, that you don't need insurance, your car doesn't need to be roadworthy, you don't even need a license. And the death rate, I mean, taking the humour away from it, it's very serious, because the death rates on the roads in New Zealand are immense, aren't they? I mean, tell me a bit about that, because I couldn't believe it when you told me before.
I mean, generally speaking, the policies in New Zealand are way behind where they are in the rest of the developed world. We say sort of roughly 25 years. In terms of the legal kind of development here. And because of the sparse population, I mean, I've relatively recently done a master's in legal studies, so I've sort of looked at the legal side of New Zealand as well. The case law hasn't evolved because of the lack of the population. There's two reasons really. People can't afford the legal, challenges if there is an ambiguity in the law, and because there's few people anyway, you're already at a disadvantage. So that means that some of the policies just haven't evolved like they have in America or the UK or the EU. There's no legal requirement to have insurance on your vehicle here. There are the equivalent of MOTs, what they call WOFs, warrant of fitness, but they're sort of flawed in many ways. There's sort of a black market that happens in terms of jumping through the hoops to get your older vehicle normally through these tests. I mean, the general age, I mean, my husband knows more about this than me, obviously. He's in that industry, but the general age of the vehicles here in New Zealand is a lot older than it would be in places like the UK. And they have this mentality, which is, quite quaint, really, the number 8 wire. So, if something's broken, just fix it with some wire. Number 8 wire is an all-purpose thing. So it's sort of it's a saying that actually is true. It's very difficult here to, you know, people aren't materialistic. They don't necessarily want brand new cars to run around in. They've got other priorities, as I say, the family life and going to the beach and going fishing. So, unfortunately, safety sometimes takes a very low priority. And it's not only the road toll death rate on the, with vehicles, it's also at work. The health and safety, what they call WorkSafe, which is the health and safety government body here. Health and Safety Executive, is it? I have to remember now what it's called in the UK. They are always struggling against this "she'll be all right" attitude. That's what they say. She'll be all right. There's no problem here. No, we don't need to do a risk assessment. It's all good, And so with that sort of very laid back attitude, obviously, accidents happen. I put accidents because that's how they frame it here. It's the accident compensation scheme is the only real way that you can get provision in terms of healthcare. Yeah, it's complicated, but yeah, it's not a very safe place to drive your car. Definitely, that's one of the things that I always say to our visitors is be extra vigilant.
I want to come back to, excuse me, about the accidents there, Ursula, because that obviously has got a knock-on effect on the health system in New Zealand. And in the UK, as I'm sure you guys hear, we're overwhelmed. The NHS is overwhelmed. It's been overwhelmed since the get-go it was pre-pandemic, and it's even worse now. And I know that we're going to be coming on and talking about the effect of public-private partnerships. But what is your health system like? Do you have a public health system? Do you have free healthcare? Do you have insurance? How does it work over there?
We do have a public health system. I mean, up until COVID, it had a very good reputation. It's limited. I think because of the divide in society, a lot of people here are relatively wealthy. There's an older age group who are retired, have financial means. And so therefore they would automatically have private health insurance. That's kind of goes without saying that most people would have had private health insurance, certainly up until recently. And I think it's very similar to the UK, where even physical location of the public hospital and the private hospital, they're very close physically and in terms of their contracts between each other. So consultants are always swapping between buildings, depending on what shift they're on and what hat they're wearing. So the public health system definitely is struggling. Well, as you say, we'll come on to talk about the mandates maybe in a minute. But yeah, I mean, migrants, professional nurses and doctors and consultants, etc., were always, sought after. And so that would be, we operate on the immigration here is based on a point system, like Australia. So depending on how many qualifications and years experience you have, depends on how many points and therefore whether you're allowed into the country or not. So teachers and nurses and doctors, etc., obviously were sought after, and New Zealand was perceived by them to be, an attractive place to work, which of course was the myth. The clean, green, 100% pure image is a PR message that is extremely successful and sits in many people's minds. Did sit in my mind. It was a worldview that I held for a long time until I moved here and saw the reality of the way that the unhealthy and pretty toxic way, really, that the workplaces exist and the environmental poisoning, etc. It's definitely, the reality is a stark contrast to the PR spin.
You've been standing up really right from the get-go, challenging the narrative of the pandemic and COVID. And we've noticed that New Zealand, Australia, Canada, the UK are pretty much in lockstep with the vaccine mandates. And of course, many of us were watching New Zealand in horror, and Australia in horror in the Southern Hemisphere, because things were happening to you seemingly a little bit before they were happening to us. And I'm presuming that's because New Zealand's small or smaller, and perhaps you're being used as an experimental test bed, a bit like the UK are as well, that we've got the NHS, so we've got a huge amount of data, which is obviously more precious than gold at the moment. But what effect had the vaccine mandates had and COVID had on New Zealand? Because I know that you've done a huge amount of work into this, and where we had nurses and doctors that were told they've got to have the jabs, otherwise they're going to lose their job, or and care home staff as well. How did all of that unravel in New Zealand?
It was a total nightmare, actually. I think partly because I am relatively well connected in lots of different countries. One of the big sort of concerns for me was watching these leaders like Jacinda and Trudeau and Boris at the time, wasn't it? Just literally repeating the same words over and again, and it was like they were on a script. And I just couldn't believe how other people couldn't see it. How it doesn't work like, international politics doesn't work like this. People disagree. Journalists normally ask questions about repeated words and phrases that don't actually make sense when you're looking at the science. So that was a big part of me becoming aware. I wasn't aware right at the very beginning. We didn't really know what was going on. But certainly we watched with horror the adverse events stacking up around the world, knowing what was coming our way, because we were about 6 months behind, as you probably know, the so-called vaccine rollout here. And it was like a big, steam, container ship was coming for you, and there was nothing you could do to stop it. It was like crazy. And the stress of that alone, I think I'm very lucky. I'm a freelance tutor and, researcher. So I wasn't under the pressures that lots of other of my colleagues were under. But yeah, I think it was November 2021. And it was the same kind of thing that happened in the rest of the world. It was an overnight thing in Parliament. They rushed through this secondary legislation to put in place what they called the vaccine order. And it started with the healthcare workers, and then it rolled out to most of the other public sector workers by the end of that month. And at that point, the people that wanted to escape the order had various options. They thought at the time that they could apply for an exemption through religious or medical grounds. That was written into the legislation. We later found out that was virtually impossible. They were, basically Sir Ashley Bloomfield was the guy who had to sign these exemptions off. And they met regularly, a committee. We don't know who those other people are. It was all very sinister, and lots of people were under extreme stress. My heart goes out to them today, even the trauma that they've suffered. So, yeah, there's still legal cases going through today that tries to get some acknowledgement and compensation in terms of those people that were fired, unceremoniously fired. Just literally one day they're there and next day they were pushed out with no, goodbyes from their colleagues, or some of them have had decades working in their vocation, and patients and students, etc., that they'd, given their lives work for, and were just swept aside like they were nobody. So we watched in the UK the guy who stood up and said in the hospital that went viral, forget what his name was, but he was, lots of people at the time thought, oh, there's a hope that, it won't be pushed here in New Zealand, but there was no hope. It was pushed forward no matter what people were thinking. And we don't really know how many people were forced out of their jobs because of that. Certainly there was probably over 1,000 nurses and a lot of midwives, doctors. I don't know how many teachers, border workers, prison workers. I mean, at the time I was working as a volunteer tutor at the local prison. And so even volunteers were forced out of their voluntary positions if they weren't, if they didn't have the sacred vaccination passport to present at the gate. So yeah, it was a very dark time and very stressful, especially looking at what was happening in the rest of the world. We felt very isolated.
I can absolutely imagine that you would feel incredibly isolated. We watched New Zealand because all of a sudden during the lockdown, we were seeing what was going on in Australia and both New Zealand and the tyranny that was going on. And we could see also the number of vaccinations was being pushed big time. And of course, now you've done so much data crunching and you've done loads of freedom of informations. I know you call them something different in New Zealand, and I know you'll explain that. And we always say to our viewers and listeners, keep writing the freedom of informations. Even though people say, oh, there's no point because we never get a satisfactory answer. It's kind of one of those processes that you have to keep going down if you really want to dig into the depths of what's going on. And you have been prolific in your freedom of informations, but not just prolific. You have been so diligent in that you've drilled down into so much data. And now I know you've been looking at the Department of Transport, for example, and looking at the bereaved days and grief days and sick days. And the statistics are absolutely staggering. Can you tell us a bit more about what you found out through looking at that data?
Yes, the Department of Transport is one of the many public sector areas in New Zealand that were mandated. And there was only 8,000 exemptions granted. And most of those, were healthcare workers. And we can maybe, the information is on my Substack about what those exemptions actually, how they broke down by sector. But because I discovered that there were no exemptions granted for the Department of Transport staff, that this is the department that deals with roads and anything to do with driving and those kinds of things. So and the trains, not that there's many trains, but there are some. And so one of my follow-on questions really was about the health of these staff, because obviously, 99% of them, those that hadn't taken early retirement or left or whatever that we didn't know about at the time of the mandates, were still working. And so they gave me eventually, it took a while, but they gave me the breakdown of the bereavement leave, the sick leave, and the leave without pay over the last 5 years. And we discovered that, just in summary, that there was 188% more sick days in 2023 compared to before COVID. And unpaid leave was up by 130%. And these were only 180 staff. These weren't road workers, because that comes under the contractors. These were mainly office-based staff. So that, sort of, this is the way really to gain some insight into what's going on out in the real world. I mean, I can see it myself anecdotally and around my own community, my friends, etc. I can see that the ill health is and sudden deaths, unfortunately, it's incredibly sad, but it is a common everyday topic of conversation, is people's poor health and the problems getting into the hospital and the problems with the emergency provision, because most of them, again, are volunteers. So these kinds of statistics looking at public sector workers, the data on what exactly is happening to their staff, staff absences, etc. That gives you a little bit more context to what's actually going on.
Yes, and I was very struck actually by the unpaid leave, because people had obviously taken holiday leave, they'd taken their paid leave, they'd taken sick leave, and they were still sick and they were having to take unpaid leave because they were so poorly. I think that's what really shocked me. And of course, then I didn't know, but you've already told me, and perhaps you can highlight this a little bit, because there is no welfare system in New Zealand. End of. So, and you tell me that there's a stigma when it comes to benefits or any kind of benefits. And I've noticed just recently in the United Kingdom, as Ed Dowd has been saying for a very long time, he's been looking at the disability data and the personal independence payment data from the UK, and it's just risen exponentially. And he said himself, Ed has said himself, the benefits the disability benefits could potentially bankrupt the country because so many more people are applying. In New Zealand, you've been using vouchers and grants to help people. So if somebody needs handrails put in, for example, maybe they'll get a grant. And it looks as though the UK are going to be following the same way, because Rishi Sunak has just recently announced that he's not prepared to live in a sick note culture, and therefore people that are disabled and in need of support will now be offered a tiered system with perhaps vouchers and grants following, and it's actually quoted, following the New Zealand model. So I think, some things we're obviously going to be following you on. Tell me a little bit, or tell our viewers a little bit about the no welfare state in New Zealand and the stigma that surrounds it, because you've got so many people now there that are vaccine injured and also bereaved. How are they managing when you've got pretty much no help and no acknowledgement, no recognition, no transparency, and no data? How are they managing?
The thing that comes to mind, Debbie, when you're talking about the stigma of welfare provision, takes me back to my childhood, where we had those little silver coins so that we could get our school meals, because we were, obviously in that class of society that needed extra help with our family, and that there was certainly some stigma amongst us kids of having to provide those little tokens in order to get our meal. And I wonder actually whether Rishi Sunak's motivation for taking over or adopting the New Zealand model of this is along those lines, is increasing that stigma. I mean, it's not that New Zealand don't have a welfare system. We do, but it's very limited. And there is definitely this stigma that surrounds it for the less fortunate. It's almost like they deliberately make it difficult. The one thing that I've learned a lot from the reachingpeople.net, shout out to David Charalambos, is, the path, the easier path is always the one that people will go down, and if it's too difficult to apply for welfare help, then people won't bother, and if it's surrounded by stigma as well, then, lots of people will just give up if they face these kinds of challenges. So in the context of the vaccine injured, it's incredibly sad that we don't really have litigation as such in New Zealand. That doesn't exist. A group action doesn't really exist. It's never really been successful here. And that's partly because of what we call this ACC that I touched on before, the Accident Compensation Scheme, which is a no-blame insurance policy for everybody's health. So if you can prove, in inverted commas, that your healthcare problem, whatever it is a result of an accident, then potentially you can get some help in that, in that regard with whatever you might need. So if you fall over on the pavement or something, and it's your GP will say, oh, well, you fell over, it was an accident, and so therefore you can have 10 sessions of physiotherapy. Here's a prescription or a recommendation or a token or whatever that you can go to an endorsed physiotherapist and get that service. So the problem that you've got with tragically the people that have been injured by the injections is that ACC are denying all claims that it is a legitimate claim. So they can't get any kind of assistance from the public health system. And of course, lots of people have been unable to work, so they can't necessarily afford to go privately. And so they're in catch-22, really, where they're gaslit, and they can't get the help, and they're alienated from society, and also there's this element of isolation. If people are living in rural areas, then they might have lost their friends and family to the mass hypnosis, and it's a very sad state of affairs, to be honest. There are groups that are helping the vaccine injured. Shout out to Linda Wharton of Health Forum NZ. She's brilliant on Twitter or X, whatever you call it now, to help raise awareness of the plight of New Zealanders suffering. So it's not like there aren't groups who are very much trying to raise awareness and help these people, but it's very challenging times.
And you're doing so much as well, Ursula. You're organising lectures, meetings, you're putting yourself out there, and you're also putting your money where your mouth is, aren't you? Because I also didn't know until I read your Substacks that you have to pay for GPs as well in New Zealand. And it doesn't come cheap either. So if you've got somebody that's got a vaccine injury and they're already not able to work, and then they've got to pay, and it's not an accident because it never happened, because of course it wasn't the vaccine. $50, I think you wrote about in your Substack, $50 to go and see a GP for a few basic tests. That's a lot of money when you've got severe injuries. But you did go to your GP because you wanted the experience, right? So tell us about your experience with your GP after you'd coughed up your $50.
Yes, I was very naughty. I deliberately made an appointment with my GP, who I hadn't seen since before COVID. In some ways, deliberately stayed away. But I wanted just to get a handle on what was going on in that clinic. And I knew they were, relatively central to a large town nearby. They were in a relatively wealthy area. And my personal GP, is from overseas herself. She's not English, but she is a professional migrant. So she there's no doubt she was still in the mass formation. So I used a few techniques to try to open her eyes a little bit. But it is a case of chipping away at these people's cognitive dissonance. I'll make another appointment for the sake of $50 to sit there for 10 minutes or whatever the allocation is, and ask her a few more questions to see what her reaction will be. But I speak to people all over New Zealand and overseas, and the general feeling is that they have no trust in the healthcare profession anymore. How can you trust these people that have really let everybody down so badly and won't even enter into a conversation? It's just unbelievable, really. And it does worry me, because now people who legitimately do have reason to go and seek professional medical help may not be doing that, and that leads to other health problems in society. So it's stacking up lots of difficult times for us ahead, I think.
It's not just doctors and nurses that aren't being trusted. It seems to be that the globalists, or those that like to think that they're in control, seem to wonder why we don't trust them. And they're trying to get us to regain our trust. And somehow I think that is going to be extremely difficult, because I can't see anybody trusting any of them again, to be quite honest. But what I was very refreshed to hear was when you were telling me, because over in the UK, we heard a lot about Jacinda Ardern. We saw her all the time. We heard her all the time. And of course, now she, like rats and sinking ships, she's disappeared off to the United States. I'm not going to steal your thunder here, but tell us what the opinion is of New Zealanders, and what happened when she tried to return to New Zealand fairly recently, I believe.
Yeah, so there was an occasion before she actually left where, at least one occasion that I know about, where she went to a community hall for some charity event, and there was heckling, protest outside, etc. And her security team ensured that she left safely by the back door, so that she didn't have to walk through the crowd who could potentially have been jeering at her, etc. So she knew at that point what she'd done was wrong, and that people were very unhappy with her. And then recently she did actually come back to get married to Clark. And it was all, very glitzy, lots of celebrities there. And, I'm sure the legacy, I didn't see it on the legacy media, but I'm sure they made the most of, Jacinda's dress and the wedding, whatever, presents and whatever, but at the vineyard. But behind the scenes, we discovered that there were, people who had been invited to support that celebration had declined for obvious reasons. And, it was, she didn't, go anywhere else in New Zealand. She wasn't the hero that perhaps she used to think she was, or other people think that she might be. She didn't, there wasn't any flag waving or anything to celebrate her return to New Zealand for a short while. She flew in, had a marriage ceremony, and flew back. And of course, we've got to remember that she's working for one of the fake fact-checking institutions over in America now. She's very much part of the propaganda machine that the WEF are, insistent that they, will just keep going. It's very intense, this censorship and propaganda, and she is an intrinsic part of it.
Let's come on and talk a bit about that, because we've been looking at how New Zealand and possibly the UK can compare. And as you all know, because I know you watch the column, you'll know that I've been focusing in on public-private philanthropic, we've got 4 Ps now, partnerships. And when I was training as a nurse, we all had different hospitals, we all had different uniforms, the same sort of training, but slightly different. We were all in competition with each other, but it was friendly competition. But we belonged to the NHS. We belonged to the country. Only now what I'm seeing is that our hospitals, they don't belong to us anymore, because they've been bought out by either a corporation or a company or even another country. Our water industry, our health industry, pretty much every sector of public services seems to be sold off. And this is not just an asset grab, it's by stealth asset transfer. And I was shocked to learn that Barts, where I'd done some of my postgraduate training, that was sold off for the Barts and the London was sold off for 1.1 billion. So our hospitals aren't ours. It seems as though in the UK, none of us have got any right over any part of our country anymore, because the government appear to have sold us out, sold us off. You're seeing the same, I know, in New Zealand. How is it impacting you guys over there?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, that in this new COVID era, we sort of reflect back onto our lives and things that we've taken for granted or just ignored at the time, and they take on new meaning. I did my undergraduate degree at the University of Warwick, which, UK column viewers will know is actually Coventry, but it's for political reasons they called it Warwick. So, and I actually worked at the medical school there while I was doing as a mature student, while I was doing my undergrad part-time. So it took me 6 years. And of course, that was the time when Blair was shouting, education, 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 and PPPs were really beginning to be expanded. So I witnessed it happening at that time, the early 2000s, at the Coventry Hospital. And the practical element of that was the car park of the hospital being sold off, and people had to pay to park to have their, even their outpatient appointments, or even, if it was an emergency. And so even the staff had to pay. It was just absolutely crazy at the time. We I remember the big outcry about it, and the residents around the hospital would suffer because, staff in emergency especially would have their driveways blocked because cars would just be parked on the road outside their house. And it was just incredible, really. And I see on the news, I had a quick check earlier, it's still going on, that increase in car parking charges. So, that's a sort of day-to-day reality, I suppose, of the history. And then 20 years later, when I'm in New Zealand, I witness, the same kind of pattern, the private, but in a different context. So I know you interviewed Dot Malik, and I was interviewed by him as well. He's a great guy. And in that interview, I spoke about the environmental aerial poisoning, and which is horrendous, but that's a topic for another day. But the public-private partnerships and philanthropy, or what Margaret Anna Alice calls philanthropaths, because they're psychopaths, is a big part of the environmental big chem poisoning. Basically, the taxpayers' money goes to pay for contractors who, undertake this poisoning, pest control. And the charities aren't really charities, they're pseudo-charities. And they're all owned. It's a bit like that revolving doors syndrome. All the board members are actually also CEOs of the chemical companies or related industries, helicopter companies or whatever. So it's just basically money laundering. It's tax-exempt money laundering that is dressed up as helping the public. So in the case of the PPPs for hospitals, people can see that the hospitals are in a terrible state. They need investment. They need new equipment. Some of them, to be honest, just need to be demolished and rebuilt because they've just been neglected for so long. And so we haven't got the money. We're in an enormous debt. Public debt and private debt in New Zealand is extremely high. So it's little wonder that the solution to the problem, that Hegelian strategy again is get the private companies in to present the to invest in the new hospitals and prisons. The prison that I used to teach at, that's having a massive investment and an expansion. Don't know why. They might need hundreds of new rooms as a prison nearby. But there you go. At least they're prepared for whatever's coming, eh, Debbie?
we have the same over here, and I can see there's so many. I mean, there's so many differences, but there's also so much that's alike. And when you look at what we actually do have left, it seems as though we've got very little. And not just the fact that our hospitals are hanging, that we don't have any staff, but now after the furlough scheme and all the loans and the grants that were given out, the cost of living has just skyrocketed over here. And I try to use fuel just as a bit of an example. And I was speaking to Professor Diane Rasmussen McCaddy the other day. She's in Scotland. And she was telling me that diesel is approximately 150, I think, a litre. In Cornwall, down in the southwest of England, it's 160 a litre. In the Channel Islands, which is not part of the UK, it's a Crown dependency, it's £1.75, but they admittedly don't pay road tax. Now, we hear all the time that your fuel over in the Southern Hemisphere is a lot cheaper. So just to give us an idea of a comparison of cost of living, what is it like over there at the moment?
Generally, the cost of living is very expensive, which is partly why, going back to that number 8 wire mentality, persists, is people prefer, which is great in some ways, they prefer to mend and make do rather than getting new because it is so expensive. Certainly the cost of food, because of course a lot of our food is imported. That's been incredibly expensive lately, the grocery bills. And that's been a good incentive in some ways for people to get out and grow their own vegetables and barter with things. So at the moment, our unleaded varies, anything up to just over $3, which is about £1.50 in the currency exchange at the moment for unleaded, and diesel is a bit more than that. So yeah, it used to be a lot cheaper. $2.11 for a litre of diesel, roughly. It's an interesting scenario. So, salaries are a lot less here, and tax, income tax isn't as much as it is in the UK, but it's certainly gone up in the last 10 years. Rates are just ridiculous. Council rates, some of them this year, they reckon that they're going to put them up by 100%. It's just absolutely crazy. And I think I mentioned to you before about the council services. They're just, ridiculous. They've totally lost touch with their actual function, their basic function, things like collecting general rubbish. They're so preoccupied with their various investments and planting pretty flowers in the roundabouts so that their towns look pretty, and they've actually totally lost touch with their primary objective of servicing the people, being the servant of the people.
I actually want to ask you about the rubbish because, in Cornwall, for example, we've just been told that we can only have 2 collections a month, and we've been given these big wheelie bins, and the wheelie bins have to be lids down. It mustn't be up, otherwise they won't take it. So basically, the wheelie bin will take 2, possibly 3 at a squash bin bags. So we've been cut down to twice a month. You over there, you don't get any bin collections. You actually have to get your own provider, get your own colour bag. It all goes on bags. It's an expensive business, isn't it? So you end up with, I guess, fly tipping. It seemed impossible. This beautiful country, New Zealand, being littered with black bin bags. Is that true?
Yeah, so this does link to the public-private partnership issue. The councils had an option a few years ago to opt out of providing a general rubbish collection. So they have to provide a recycling collection, but general rubbish, not necessarily. So there's private companies that provide the collection, and it can be very expensive, like $10 a week. So, yeah, as you say, the option for a lot of people, rather than paying the extra money for actually a very unreliable service as well, is to just burn the rubbish. So they're burning plastic, which isn't great for the environment, and or they'll just, take it in their car and dump it on the side of the road, which means that taxpayers obviously have to pick up the cost for the council to pay the same contractors to come and pick up that rubbish. It's just, and it all goes to the landfill, which is privately owned as well. So it's insanity, and if you ask for an OIA, an Official Information Act request, which is the same as the Freedom of Information Act in the UK and the US, you'll get a response along the lines of, we can't give you that information. We can't tell you how much the contractors are paid because that's commercially sensitive. So, you end up going round in circles trying to find out who is being paid, how much they're being paid, who's auditing those services, because, as I say, they're not reliable. And it's just, it's a craziness, absolute craziness.
I've got to say, I've experienced that myself because, as most people in the UK know, but perhaps not abroad, we privatised the water industry back in the 80s, courtesy of Margaret Thatcher. And most of our viewers and listeners will know that I've had quite a few issues with water and floods and water companies. And what I found out, to my horror, was in my area, it's a company called Southwest Water. And when you write to the water company for freedom of information, the first time I did it, of course, I received a reply back to say, we're exempt from freedom of information because we're a private company. However, they're a private company performing a public duty. But they say that, oh, no, we don't need to give you any information because it's a matter of national security. So they lock you out of that as well. And of course, the way that the asset has been transferred, instead of the public paying for an asset, for a sewer, for example, if we look at a sewer, and the community goes, we need a new sewer, but the government said, well, yeah, okay, you can have a new sewer, but we'll have to charge you more in tax. And the community goes, no, we're not paying tax. So the government come back with a scheme where they've offered the contract to a private company and said, look, if you provide these residents with a new sewer, basically that's yours. You can, and that asset has gone then. And so the public aren't paying an increased tax, but then they pay the increased sewerage bill or the increased water bill. So whichever way it comes back to the public. So that is happening both in the UK and New Zealand. And obviously, our countries have been lost to corporations, globalizations. And I guess that this is the gateway to the one world government that is going to be completely unelected because we've sold out to private companies. And what you said about charities, here again, the big charities, the big ones like Cancer Research UK, Macmillan, the National Autistic Society, the big ones, to me, they're nothing more than quangos. They're just an excuse to siphon off money into different directions, which of course makes it very difficult for the smaller grassroots charities that are doing incredibly valuable work. They just get completely swept under the carpet because they haven't got a whole team of bid writers that's taking the money from the public coffers. So, I mean, the public-private partnership, philanthropic partnerships is a huge issue. But I'm looking at the window behind you and I'm seeing when we started, it was pitch black outside and your day is about to begin as our day is about to finish. But before I do finish, Ursula, I just want to ask you very quickly, because I know hopefully you'll be speaking to Charles because you've done an awful lot of work on the environment and environmental poisoning. And I'm hoping very much you'll be able to speak to my colleague, Charles Mallet, about that. But I've been looking into something called geofencing. And in the UK, many people are surprised. They look at their phones because they're on their phones all the time. They look at their phones And they think, oh, that's weird. I was only looking at a pair of brown shoes or a red coat yesterday. And now all of a sudden, my phone is full of these offers to buy brown shoes and red coat. How did my phone know that? And I've been explaining to our viewers and listeners that geofencing are these invisible zones. So if you walk into a store, that store will be able to see what you're looking at, what you're considering purchasing, what you might desire, what you're thinking. And you're walking into these zones all the time, whether it be a public zone, a public area like a hospital or a court or a prison perhaps, or into a retail area. So I was very shocked when you, and oh, by the way, when it comes to cows, because I know we're coming on to cows, when it comes to cows, we've been seeing cows with masks on. So I was very shocked, Ursula, when you told me that New Zealand has actually gone one step on with cows using a different type of geofencing. Can you tell us a bit about New Zealand's version of geofencing with cows?
We've got 5G towers as a problem. Like, you know, everybody seems to have protests about 5G towers. And one of the queries in New Zealand was, of course, we don't have the population to support the costs of putting these great big towers in. And then we started seeing cows with these collars on in the fields, because I don't know whether you know that, I mean, generally New Zealand is known for its sheep, but actually dairy is its biggest export. You know, between 5 and 10% of the GDP here is dairy product, mainly to China. So it's very important to maximise the output from these cows. And one way that they can do that is for farmers to have subscriptions that allow them to track what each cow has eaten, what each cow has produced in terms of milk, and also to control their fencing. So rather than having a physical electric fence, they can, through various technological posts in various places, control where the cows are allowed to roam. So that's tracking the cows and preventing them from entering certain paddocks at certain times is a big part of the control mechanism, or, you know, as you mentioned the other day, the Internet of Animals. That is this transhumanist kind of agenda. It's pretty depressing how the technology is, you know, pushed so far ahead so quickly under stealth. You know, people aren't necessarily aware of what's happening around them. It's definitely a big part of the rural life, the technology.
I've got two very important final questions for you. Well, I mean, they're not, because we could talk forever. And I mean, we have done on Zoom. It's just gone on and on, ladies and gentlemen that are watching. Really, I could have sat up all night talking to Ursula, because honestly, she's got so much information in her brain. But two things that I have to ask you about briefly, if you don't mind, before you disappear and start your day, is the two C's, and censorship and China. So can I ask you how New Zealand is coping with censorship and the Chinese migrants? I think you're getting quite a lot of Chinese migrants. Could you explain a bit more?
Yeah, the partnership between New Zealand and the CCP is very close. There's no doubt that we rely heavily upon China for our export market. And there are a lot of Chinese owned properties and land and infrastructure in New Zealand. So it's just under the surface. You have to dig a little bit, and 9 times out of 10, if you look at Companies House, you know, the equivalent of Companies House, and you'll see the directors of these corporates are based in or have something to do with China. Definitely, just like the UK, the universities here have campuses in China, and or they will have some sort of base in China, on the understanding that Chinese students are a big source of income, or they were until relatively recently, for international student fees. And that has had an impact, there's no doubt, on the corruption of academia here, which, is probably the subject for another whole interview in terms of how academia has been captured. It's slightly concerning, actually, the amount of influence that China has on New Zealand. It puts it in a very difficult situation when there's so much tension geopolitically.
There really is so much to talk about, and you're right. Academia, the environment, farming, health, vaccination mandates, where we're going moving forward. All of this, there's just so much to talk about, and sadly, there's not enough time to talk about it all. But I know that we're going to be coming back to you. Before I hand over to you for the last word, I want to take this opportunity to say to people that are watching, in New Zealand, in Australia, wherever you are in the world, we'd like to hear from you what's going on in your country. And if you like what we're doing and you can help us and become one of the family and subscribe to UK Column, we'd be really, really happy to welcome you. And please share the material wherever you can. And on this occasion, particularly, I want to thank Ursula so much for getting up at the crack of dawn, and also to our wonderful producer, Stephanie Sinclair, who has stayed late to keep the studio open to enable this interview. So thank you to both of you. But just before I hand across to you, Ursula, for your last word, is there anything that's burning that you think we really need to include, or perhaps maybe we should save for another time? Is there anything you want to add before we sign off?
Just the various groups, really, in New Zealand. I mean, we do have quite a strong freedom movement, even though, as you say, it's very much censored from the legacy media. We have the Nurses for Freedom group that I try to help out as much as I can. They've actually formed, you might be interested in speaking directly to them, Debbie. They've actually formed a spin-off from the Australian Nurses Professional Association, the union there. I'll give you the link so you can add it to the show notes. The teachers group, New Zealand Teachers Speaking Out with Science, and also the New Zealand Doctors Speaking Out with Science. They're two separate but connected, closely connected groups who are fighting for some recognition through the courts and some compensation in view of the mandates, the vaccine mandates that they suffered from. And the environmental work that me and my colleagues are involved with, if people can go to the People's Inquiry 2020.nz to find out a bit more about that if you're interested in the reality that goes up against this myth of clean, green, 100% pure New Zealand PR spin. Sorry to be to bust another myth about the utopia that is New Zealand, but unfortunately, like a lot of these things that we believe, it doesn't take much research to find out that it's not actually the reality. But so there's a couple of things to finish on.
Ursula, we've been talking all this time, and I've suddenly realised that actually we should have given a bit of your background. You're British born, you've come from the UK, and I didn't ask you about your history because your history is quite phenomenal. You have done tons. Can you tell us, I know it's a bit back to front, and I do apologise for that because I think we're going to be coming back to you many times for information. So I just want our viewers and listeners just to get a little bit of a flavour of who Ursula is.
So first of all, a big shout out to all the freedom lovers in Essex. I'm an Essex girl by birth, and I do still have family there. So a big shout out to you guys. I've travelled a lot all over the world. I've done lots of different jobs in lots of different areas. I was a mature student during the Blair years at the University of Warwick. The job that I did then was at the medical school while I was working and studying part-time. I then did an ESOL qualification, so that allowed me to teach at the refugee centre in Coventry City Centre, amongst other things. And then I went to Nottingham University to do my teaching qualification, adult teaching qualification. Then I stayed on to do my master's whilst I was teaching at Northampton college. So I was teaching the beginning nurses there at Northampton College in their foundation to their degree. So that was where my sort of interest in health and well-being sort of evolved. And then I was lucky enough to win a scholarship to do my PhD at Canterbury Christchurch University in Kent. So again, a shout out to Canterbury. That was when I was investigating Ofsted and the negative impact that it had on teachers at that time. So very much now when we're looking at things where the government is trying to measure things that aren't measurable, that's where my interest in education kind of, started in trying to question that authoritarianism. So we moved to New Zealand about 10 years ago, and I did a lectureship for 2 years at the local university, which was a very difficult time. And for reasons that I won't go into now, I was forced out of that position. And like lots of academics, I was gagged. So I can't discuss that. But it just highlighted to me how corrupt academia is and the result of the mess that we're in now. So since then, I've been a freelance researcher, writer, teacher. I do some adult teaching in various workplaces, etc., and a bit of writing. Yeah. So since the COVID era, I've been involved in helping some of the groups that have suffered during the COVID era and trying to raise awareness of their situation by writing about it and attending and organising meetings.
Thank you again, hugely, because we need to know what's going on over the other side of the world. And clearly, it's very similar to what's going on in this hemisphere as well. And we know that we're going to be keeping in close contact with you, Ursula, and there's plenty more topics to talk about. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to you for your last word, and thank you to everyone that is watching, especially if you're in New Zealand. Our love and our prayers go with you. Ursula, your last word.
Thank you, Debbie. I really appreciate it. So I would say just don't give up. We're very well connected. It's pretty amazing that even though I might have lost to the mass formation some of my friends and colleagues and family members over these last 4 years, hopefully not forever, but I've made some amazing connections from people all over the world. So don't give up. We are connected, and we are learning, and we're growing. Reachingpeople.net, I would give a shout out to that. So if you want some help with learning about the behavioural science and how to reach people, reachingpeople.net is a fabulous resource. And be the change you want to see. We're all fed up with staring at these screens. Please encourage people to put down their phones and connect with humanity again, and create, gatherings of people. Whatever it might take, have some authentic gatherings and reconnect with people around you. That's the way that we get out of this mess that we're in. And keep smiling and look after yourself. And thank you.